Welcome everyone to the new NYC Complexity and Cynefin meetup. What are you laughing at? Tonight we're joined by Riva Greenberg, who will be presenting on how she uses complexity science and the Cynefin Framework in the management of type 1 diabetes. And I will, as always, a bit of housekeeping, ask you to make sure you're muted unless you're Riva. And also, please hold the chat during Riva's presentation. I know it's very exciting to use the chat, but I find it distracting, and I think it's a question of respect for me, for the presenter. At the end of Riva's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. You can put your questions in the chat. You can also raise your little hand, and if we see you, we'll answer it. But please do try to put your question in the chat so that Jocko and I can sort through and make sure we're catching everybody in case we don't see your hand, okay? So with that, please welcome Riva Greenberg.
Hi. First, let me just say some of your faces are familiar because actually my husband, Baudouin, had shown me Jocko's last presentation. So it's nice to see some familiar faces. And as Barbara said, I'm going to talk about type 1 diabetes, which I have, and how it works within the Cynefin Framework. So before I start, thank you for coming, although I had nothing to do with it. And I'm just curious if you'd raise your hand, does anybody have type 1 diabetes or know a lot about it because you know someone who has it? Yeah, okay, great, 2 people. So basically that means I can say anything, 3, and you won't know whether it's right or wrong, which, whew, that's a relief. No, really, it's great. And I'm delighted to be here and do this. So my technician here is going to start the presentation.
You're on.
Great, thanks. So you may recognize this cover. It's a book, some of you may already have it, about the Cynefin Framework. And tonight I'm going to take you through a little bit of complexity science, but mostly the Cynefin Framework and how it impacted my life with type 1 diabetes, and how I believe it can help millions of other people who live with diabetes, and also the health professionals who treat us. Now, I had heard, I've been married to Bao. Yes, now I'm going to shorten Baudouin to Bao. We've now been married 20 years. And so I had heard about complexity science and the Cynefin Framework. But it wasn't until he asked me if I would co-edit this book with him that I really began to understand what this is all about. And you may think, wow, that's pretty loving of me that I would agree to co-edit a 376-page book about something I barely knew. But the truth is, I didn't want to disturb the gods. And that's just a little imprint of our chapter. When I told my mother that Bao and I were engaged, she said, "Oh my God, I have to show you something." And it turns out when I was a baby that the fabric around my crib was scenes from Holland. There was a little Dutch girl in her pigtails, the little Dutch boy. And if you don't know Baudouin, he is actually Dutch Indonesian to be precise. And she said, "You were always babbling to the Dutch boy, no matter how I put you down." And she said, Wicked Witch style, even if I put you out the other end of the crib, you would crawl your way to go talk to the Dutch boy. So I figured if the Dutch boy asked me to edit this book, I'm going to edit this book with him. So this is what I want to take you through in the next hour. I give you a little introduction to myself and how I got to be doing what I'm doing, the Cynefin Framework as it applies to type 1 diabetes. And in some of the slides, if you see T1D, that's the abbreviation, that the framework can liberate people who live with diabetes, I believe any real chronic illness, from the self-blame and judgment and the giving up that can go on, and that the framework can help our health professionals create closer, better relationships with their patients, and so possibly better outcomes for everybody. And then, as Barbara said, we'll do Q&A. So this is me. I was diagnosed at 18 in 1972. So if you're quick, you know how old I am now. I'm not ashamed of it. In fact, I've been living with diabetes for 49 years, and next week, February 22nd, is actually my 49th anniversary, which we will celebrate somewhere, somehow. In short, in brief, the quickest definition I can give you of type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 2 is the more common variety. 9 out of 10 people who have diabetes have type 2. And it's considered a lifestyle condition. Maybe they're overweight, somewhat sedentary, and it's really a condition of insulin resistance. After a while, eating a lot of carbohydrates makes the pancreas keep pumping out insulin until the pancreas gets really tired and the cells don't register all the insulin that's there. And so insulin's effectiveness decreases. That's type 2. Type 1 isn't that at all. It's an autoimmune condition. So my cells killed off my insulin producing beta cells. And so while the course of treatment may be similar, the cause is very different. And as you'll discover, managing type 1 diabetes is much more intensive. In the beginning, it was lonely. I was 18, I was a freshman in college. I remember I was put in the hospital for 4 days and taught how to give myself insulin injections. And I brought my show and tell. So I give you a little demonstration. So this is a typical syringe I'll use to give myself shots whenever I eat, because I need to take insulin to cover food. This is called an insulin pen. This is actually a kind of fancy insulin pen where I actually have an app for it on my phone. So it'll tell me when's the last time I took an injection, how much I took, and what they call how much insulin is on board, still in my body. And I dial up my dose at this end. I put a needle here, I press the button, and it plunges the insulin into my body. And this is what a typical glucose meter looks like. And I would take a strip, put it in the glucose meter, put a drop of blood on it that I prick myself to get. And then in 5 seconds, it gives me a readout of my blood sugar level. And lastly, this is my continuous glucose monitor that I'm actually wearing on my arm. Now, forgive me, I can't see myself, so I'm hoping you can see what I'm showing you. But this is the transmitter and the receiver with a little needle in my arm, checking my intestinal fluid. And then I get a readout every 5 minutes that tells me what my blood sugar is. And basically, I want to keep myself between the red and yellow lines. That's my target range. And every black dot is my blood sugar every 5 minutes. When I sat down to do this presentation at 10 to 7, my blood sugar was 91. It's now 114. Why? Because stress raises your blood sugar. And as happy as I am to be here, my autonomic nervous system is throwing stress hormones out into my body, and that's raising my blood sugar. So that's really kind of a preface to one of my key messages, which is blood sugar is a constantly fluid, emergent property. So the way I have to manage my diabetes and my blood sugar, and I'll basically talk about managing blood sugar because that's really what we do, is it's said actually that people with type 1 diabetes make 180 decisions a day. So I always have a ticker tape in the back of my head thinking, when am I going to eat? What am I going to eat? How many carbohydrates are in that? Based on that, how much insulin do I need to inject? Then what am I going to do? Then how's that going to affect my blood sugar? Then check my blood sugar on my continuous glucose monitor if I'm wearing it, on my meter if I'm not. If it's too high, I have to make a decision whether or not it's time to take some more insulin and bring it down. If it's too low, I have to eat something to just try to bring it back in range. This is the daily dance that everyone with type 1 diabetes does. And so basically, it's a second job. And then on top of that, there's so many factors that can affect my blood sugar, none of which I have control over. My body, my heartbeat, my blood pressure, what's my liver doing? Is it throwing glucose out into my bloodstream? My hormones, right now my blood sugar is going up. I can't do anything about it. I don't know how high it's going to go. So that's all part of what makes blood sugar a constantly fluid, emergent property. And then there's life's unpredictability. If I intend to take a walk, and so I've determined how much to eat and how much insulin to take based on that, and all of a sudden it rains and my walk is rained out, then I have to make a new set of decisions. So that's the basic drumbeat of what goes on when you're managing type 1 diabetes. Imagine how tiring that is. Imagine how responsible somebody with type 1 diabetes feels for managing their condition. So tonight, I want to take you on a path where we'll look at how the Cynefin Framework can really help us and help people with diabetes and our health professionals make this an easier job. And the truth is, I didn't know any of this the first 40 years I had diabetes. And when I first got diabetes, and I'm assuming everybody here in this group knows, of course, this is the Cynefin Framework, everything that they did to help me came from the clear domain. All we knew were best practices. Do this, do that. I was basically handed a diabetic diet, which said don't eat candy bars. And I was told to take 1 injection of insulin a day at 8 a.m. and how much to take. The amazing thing is 49 years later, when we have so much more information and knowledge about managing this condition, we have so much more technology to help us do that. Most of our health professionals are still working out of the best practices domain, which is really amazing. But when Bao introduced me to this, I really saw that I'm not entirely responsible for my results. And it let a lot of my self-criticism and perfectionism, it let me drop it, and it offered me an enormous amount of freedom. And that's what I believe it can offer to other people. So very quickly, I just want to let you know, I had been an advertising copywriter most of my career. 2003, I lost my job and I went to a diabetes educator after having diabetes for 32 years for the first time, because Bao and I were going to get married. And I wanted to be as healthy as I could be for him. And I began to think, well, maybe I could help other people with diabetes. That appealed to me. And I began by using my writing skills. So I wrote 3 books and hundreds of articles, and I became a peer mentor and educated other patients around the country. And I went to a lot of conferences to learn and to network. And then I began being invited to conferences as a speaker. I was speaking at the World Health Organization, at the United Nations. Yes, now I'm just showing off. And if you're married to Baudouin, and if you know him, you know that I had to become a researcher because everything has to be thoroughly researched. So we went to Israel, where I was interviewing one of the top diabetologists, Itamar Raz, to learn what he knew about preventing and managing diabetes. And then when Bao realized that so much of his work and my work intersected, that his niche in sustainable performance improvement was relevant to managing diabetes, his niche in leadership development was relevant to people with diabetes needing to lead themselves, we began working on various projects together. So our marriage expanded to include complexity. Here he was in the Netherlands doing a presentation for health professionals. He comes with me on a lot of my exotic locale conferences. This was Dubai. So, I began to think, well, maybe he just wants to help me for the travel perks. But that's okay, because I got a photographer in the bargain. And Bao shared with me that the fact that he comes from a Dutch familial culture, when we got married, he really wanted to help me with this diabetes thing. He really wanted to find the golden formula that if we could just latch on to that, then all my blood sugars would be great. And he really worked hard at it. And then he said, and it's in the book in our chapter, one night we were out to dinner and he got it. We had just ordered, the waiter walked away, calculated the carbohydrates I was going to eat in my head. I dialed up my dose of insulin. There's a needle here. I stuck it in my thigh. I injected, because when you take insulin, you're supposed to pre-inject 15 to 20 minutes, because part of the complexity is you have to time when insulin will be actually working in your body with when the food is being digested and turned into sugar in your bloodstream. And then 20 minutes later, the waiter came back and he said, I'm really sorry. We just had an accident in the kitchen. Your meal will take another 20 minutes. And that's when Bao said a light went off for him. He understood how. You cannot find a magic formula. You cannot manufacture a result. It is not cause and effect. It is an emergent property of all the things going on in your body, in your environment, in life. So I will tell you that type 1 diabetes is one of the most intensely self-managed conditions. Basically, all day long, as I said earlier, I am manually trying to keep my glucose in a range. Why? To prevent and delay diabetes complications. I'm not going to get any better. All this work is so I don't get worse. So on the left, you see what I showed you on my CGM. And the trick is to stay between the lines, to stay between the yellow and black lines all day. So what looks like about 3 o'clock, my blood sugar was dipping below the red line, too low. I had to treat it. Then around 6:30, it's dipping again. Then around 5:30, it looks like it's dipping again. Then at the end of that line, maybe 10 o'clock in the morning, it's starting to go too high. At all those junctures, I have to do something. The list on the right just outlines a few of the actions I take, and below it, a few of the obstacles. My meter is allowed to be 20% incorrect. Food labels, which I read for the carbohydrate content, is allowed to be 20% incorrect. The X factor, you probably haven't heard of it. You could do the same thing 2 days in a row and get 2 different results. And the recursive loop, which I had never heard of before, but apparently every time I do something, I look at what I've got, my blood sugar, what I'm going to eat, if I'm going to exercise, and I make a decision and I take an action, that action then further creates complexity around my ongoing blood sugar. So that's really, I guess, the nitty-gritty of it that I want to communicate. And why am I doing all that work? Because having high and low blood sugars over time creates what's called diabetes complication. Heart disease, nerve damage, kidney disease, blindness, all kinds of things. And so the work is to avoid these. And in the short term, 24/7, 365 days a year, no days off, I'm working at it. Because if you get it wrong, you can die. Blood sugars that are too high and too low can cause coma, seizures, and death, even in sleep. So one of my most critical blood sugar checks is before I go to sleep. I need to know where I am. And I need to have a safe enough margin, knowing that I tend to drop 20 to 30 points overnight so that I don't drop too low. And I've been very fortunate. In 49 years, I've had 3 events that were dangerous, almost life-threatening. And I'll tell you about the one in London. It was early in our marriage, and we were staying at friends of Badawane. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and I didn't feel well. And I walked into the bathroom, and I put my hands on the sink, and I stared into the mirror of the medicine cabinet, and I didn't have any thoughts. And after 20 seconds, I thought, what am I doing here? And after another 10 seconds, I had a whisper of a thought, because when your blood sugar is severely low, your thoughts don't come through clearly. A whisper of a thought, oh, I must be low. So I walked back into our bedroom as quietly as possible, because I didn't want to awaken my new husband, who had told me many times how important his sleep was to him. And I reached for my meter and my glucose tablets, which are pure sugar. And I walked back into the bathroom, and I sat on the black and white cold tile floor, and I opened the glucose tablet case, and I ate 3. Oh, I'm sorry. If I forgot to say, the first thing I did when I came back was I checked my blood sugar on my meter, and it was 29. I will not forget that number. And I ate my 3 glucose tablets and I lay down on the tile floor, just waiting for the glucose tablets to raise my blood sugar, which typically takes about 20 minutes. And after about a half an hour, I got up, I walked back into the bedroom, and I crawled back into bed. And of course, next day I told Bao what happened, and he said, "Don't you ever not wake me up if that ever happens again." And that was scary. And so that's what's always a potential risk if you don't take care of this. This is a really interesting space in the framework for me, the liminal space between complicated and complex. And I realized that I spend a lot of time going back and forth between complicated and complex. So things I can figure out, like recognizing my patterns, so then this is a logical next step for me to take, would be in the complicated domain, right? I can analyze a set amount of factors. But things like, life's unpredictability, that I'm walking to the subway, so I've calculated that walk and how much insulin I took and how much food I ate, because the walk will drop me 20 points, and now the subway station is closed, so we have to walk to a further subway station, and my blood sugar is going to drop another 20 points. That's complex. I couldn't have known that or calculated that or figured that out. The fact that my blood sugar for a couple of days in a row seems higher than it should be, but I don't figure out till the 3rd day that my insulin has spoiled. And I could only figure that out looking back. That's in the complex domain. And so I'm going often between what's complicated and what I can affect, what's complex, and what I have to figure out with what will emerge. And that space in between, that liminal area, I have a beautiful example of that. So on my continuous glucose monitor, I see my numbers. And just so you know, I'm now at 125. So I see my numbers, and when they're climbing, and so if you can see this, it says 125 and there's a straight arrow. And the straight arrow means I'm relatively stable. It doesn't mean my blood sugar isn't going up or down, but it's doing it slowly. But there are other times when the arrow is at 45 degrees, and that means I'm going up or down more quickly. And there are times when it's at 90 degrees, means it's going up or down more quickly. And there's times when there are 2 arrows going up and down. And so when I see an arrow going up, I'm so trained to not want to have high blood sugar that I often take an action too quickly. So I take more insulin to knock my blood sugar back so it won't go too high. And what happens is it was too fast. If I had waited another 10 minutes, the arrow would have stabilized. I would have seen that I'm not going to go too high. But taking that action too soon, because I'm not comfortable being in that liminal space, then puts me on what we call the roller coaster. My blood sugar will then go too low in an hour, and then I have to get it up again. So I needed to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that's a beautiful example of the liminal space. And by the way, I should just say, it was written under the first graphic, but these graphics were done by Sue Borchardt, who was the illustrator for that Cynefin book. And these are all her gorgeous illustrations. In this one, it says, the word liminal comes from the Latin root, limen or lumen, meaning threshold. A liminal space is an in-between space, one in which you have left the known, but what is emerging has not yet formed. And my God, I think that's an incredible definition of what it's like to live with type 1 diabetes. So our health professionals basically work from the ordered side of the framework. There are best, and the truth is, living with type 1 diabetes, you wander throughout all these domains. There are best practices in the clear domain. When blood sugar is severely too high or too low, there are best practices to treat that. There are times I'm in the complicated domain, as I said earlier. I do have a carb to insulin ratio that helps me figure out my dosing. I do look at my numbers frequently, but they don't understand there's also a left side. There's also a disordered side. And so what they do limits patients' success. I give you an example of my friend Miriam, who has type 1 diabetes. She told us this story when we met her at a diabetes conference. She was at an endocrinologist appointment, and I don't know, they were talking about pricking her finger, how she does it to get the blood on the strip, to check her blood sugar in her meter. And she said she pricks her finger on the side where it doesn't hurt. And he said, no, that's wrong. You have to prick it at the top of your finger. And she said, when I do that, the blood slides down my nail bed. And it became an argument. And at some point, he jotted some notes and he walked out while she was still there. And she said, I leaned over the desk to read his notes, and he had written down, patient is belligerent. And Miriam did not go back. So if health professionals can get a better understanding of the Cynefin framework and the value it offers, they can more easily keep patients engaged. And I'm going to kind of sum that up toward the end. But this is really the crushing lie we're all told in diabetes. You can control your blood sugar. There are books about it. There are celebrities on TV ads telling us constantly, diabetes doesn't control me. I control my diabetes. Every doctor is taught this. Somehow they think our blood sugar numbers are the result of cause and effect. Do this and that will happen. Eat this, take that much insulin, you'll get this good number. I cannot control my blood sugar, and I have 49 years of experience. And I've done a ton of research and experimentation. I cannot know what my next number's going to be. What I can do through my knowledge is know what can influence my numbers, and know when I see a number, how to nudge it, how to navigate it back to my blood sugar target range. And that's really the key for people with diabetes to know, and for health professionals to tell their patients. I have a friend who's a pediatric endocrinologist, and we talked with him about this, and he said, health professionals are taught to look at the body, as if it's an engineering problem. And they're afraid if they tell people with diabetes they can't control their blood sugar, people will give up. they'll lose all their authority in the eyes of their patients. They can't see any win in that. But of course, what happens is just the opposite. Patients are told they can control their blood sugar. They can't, and then they feel like a failure and give up. It's much easier to give up when you measure yourself against an impossible goal than when you acquire skills to succeed with reality. And here's a funny thing about technology. There's been a ton of new technology in diabetes in the last 10 years. And I love my continuous glucose monitor. That's my friend Ginger on the left, and that's a continuous glucose monitor on the right. So she put the sensor on her arm, it bled, created all kinds of problems. Ginger is like me. She's an expert patient. She speaks at conferences. But here's something that just happens. Technology is not perfect. It comes with its own burdens, its own problems. If you wear an insulin pump with tubing, the tubing can get occluded. You're not getting your insulin. I know many people that this has happened to, and unawares, they weren't receiving any insulin in their body for a few hours, and they went into what's called ketoacidosis, when you have no insulin in your body, which is a very dangerous condition. You can die of it. So on the one hand, technology is tremendous. And yes, with more data, I can have more clues. At the same time, it comes with burdens, and it solidifies this myth for health professionals that surely now, with a continuous glucose monitor, my patients can control their blood sugar. And it solidifies the myth for people with diabetes and the sense of failure that even with my continuous glucose monitor, I can't control my blood sugar. And you can't. You just can't. All to say, you can imagine that type 1 diabetes can take an emotional toll. I just love this picture because that's sort of how it feels some days. Now, the list on the right are a lot of the feelings that go on with a condition that you have to self-manage, where you're always judging yourself, where others are judging you, where your family members might be judging you, where your doctor's judging you. And I'm really hoping that if we could introduce health professionals to the Cynefin Framework and complexity science, that a lot less of this would happen. And I have noticed at conferences, when I explain briefly this idea that we can't control our blood sugar, that we live in the complex domain where blood sugar is an emergent property, I see the relief in their faces. They tell me, literally say, they feel liberated. And I sort of liken it to doing their happy dog dance. They truly, as do I, feel this burden fall off their shoulders. Because this is the truth. Managing type 1 diabetes and blood sugar, there are just too many known and unknown unknowns. That while I say I wander, my diabetes wanders, my blood sugar wanders through every domain, it mostly lives in the complex domain. And I can tell you even with 49 years, I probably end up in the confused domain once a week. So just the other night, I made soba noodles for dinner. The first time in I don't know how long. So I read the carbohydrate content on the package. I estimated a serving. I figured out how much insulin I needed to cover it. I took my injection. Half an hour after I ate, my blood sugar was taking a nosedive. So I ate something more. It continued to take a nosedive for the next 3 hours. And I had to keep eating to bring it back up. In fact, I had to get into bed with my phone by the pillow so that I could watch my blood sugar on my sensor for a half an hour before I felt safe going to sleep. That's not an extraordinary event. The environment we live in, our body, life's unpredictability, this recursive loop, what we do and then what happens, all puts us most of the time in that complex domain. But the good news is, of course, if health professionals and people with diabetes understood the model, the framework, and where they are in the framework, then they would know the appropriate action to take. On the one hand, they could stop blaming and criticizing themselves, and they could know the appropriate action to take. So just as in the complex domain, it's about probing, sensing, and responding, then translating that to managing blood sugar, it's about recognizing your personal blood sugar patterns. It's about learning the carbohydrate content of various foods and the amount, and your carb to insulin ratio, which means how much insulin it takes to cover how many carbohydrates. By learning these things, then you are far better prepared to influence, nudge, navigate your blood sugar as it shows up in this consistent, fluid, emerging way. And do safe to fail experiments. I love that, which I think I basically learned when we edited our chapter. Safe to fail experiments. So for me, a safe to fail experiment is as my blood sugar was going down from miscalculating how much insulin I needed for soba noodles, and it might not have even been a miscalculation. Another day it might have worked, but this day, given whatever was going on in my body, it didn't. I eat a small amount and then see how much takes me up. In the early days, I will tell you, because I probably won't meet you, and if I do, then I'll have to shoot you. But in the early days, when I would have low blood sugar, one of the symptoms is you are ravenous. So I would go to the refrigerator and I would eat everything in it. I would eat leftover pie and cookies and bread with jam and anything and everything. And then, of course, guess what? An hour later, my blood sugar had gone from 50 to 350. So safe to fail experiments. Just have one glucose tablet. Just have one spoonful of honey and see what happens. This really is the crux. My belief about the benefits of this framework is, as I said, it would help those of us with diabetes and health professionals do appropriate sense making and recommend appropriate actions based on what domain a situation is in the framework, right? So in clear, there are definitely best practices when blood sugar is low and high. In complicated, there are various factors you can analyze and figure out and have a handle on what to do. In complex, it opens up a space for conversations where patients discover what they can do in what they call the evolutionary potential of the present. And when patients figure out what they can do and what they're willing to do, there's a whole lot more trust that they're going to do it. It's their idea. Health professionals can meet patients where they are and explore context of patient's life. Predominantly create safety, closer, more trusting relationships, because I truly believe the relationship is at the crux of how well a patient is going to do, whether or not they're willing to follow a health professional and listen to their advice and co-create their treatment plan. And that's it. It's in the partnership. It's in the working together that the work becomes less for each and everything becomes better and each becomes more successful. And I'm going to conclude here with a brief story. In 2014, Bao and I went to India, to Bangalore, to do some pro bono work at a diabetes clinic for the poor. And it was wonderful. We spent 18 days and we gave a lot of classes on an approach we've developed called the flourishing approach, which is really about helping people flourish rather than cope with diabetes. And much of the flourishing approach is based on complexity science and the Cynefin Framework. And this woman, a lovely woman who's a dietitian at the clinic, came up to us just after she had seen a patient. She was all smiles. And she said, "Riva, I just saw my patient. I see him for 3 years. Every time I tell him what to do, comes back, he hasn't done it. But I remembered what you told us. You said, discuss with him what he'd like to do." And then I asked him how he thought he could do it. And before I knew it, we were both smiling. And he left, he was laughing. She said, "I can't believe it. It was magical." That's what happens when we honor what emerges, when we're not so confined by the rules. She left her security of being in the clear domain to wander over into the complex and allowed herself to explore what might emerge with her patient. So from all of this, perhaps I've learned 3 lessons. One is, if you can, marry a Dutchman who knows complexity science and the Cynefin Framework. 2, truly, the stakes are high in type 1 diabetes. As someone once said to me who had it, you're either a superstar or a train wreck. And I think the framework can be equally impactful to help people. High reward for high stakes. And that I'm perhaps still working on the value of being comfortable with being uncomfortable. For after all, otherwise, I couldn't have given this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Riva. Oh my goodness. I feel like such a slacker.
Why?
I don't have to do anything all day long. Just for the audience in general, we will not be starting a complexity dating service, just so you know. That's for another time.
Not enough Dutchmen.
So we're going to open it up for questions now. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand, but we would appreciate it. Oh, there's Bao. Bao has joined us for Q&A. Put it in the chat, and Jocko and I will take a look at that, or you can raise your hand and we'll ask you to open your microphone. Riva, just to start it off, one of the things I was thinking about in your presentation is that it's also they haven't acknowledged how the bar has changed as well, right? Because originally insulin was like a gift. It was like, okay, because this used to be a death sentence, right? I mean, it was just flat out, you're not going to last very long if you have type 1 diabetes.
Actually, insulin was discovered 100 years ago,
right?
1921, 22. This is sort of the, whatever you call the 100-year celebration. And yes, before that, you were put on a starvation diet and you lasted a number of weeks and months, and then you died.
But it was like, okay, now we know how to save these guys and we don't have to do anything else. We're done. Yay, us. And so they perpetuate that, and I'm not saying that they're, there's an evil intention there. It's just that the idea that this is an evolving and emerging situation doesn't seem to as in much of medicine, doesn't seem to factor in. It's like, we did it, we solved it, we're great.
I think they don't think in terms of emergence. They haven't been trained to think that way. They've been trained to see the body in a very mechanical, machine-like way. And as you said, thank God we have insulin. So just take insulin to cover your food without really thinking through the constant everyday calculations that go on. Really, they're more like guesses. And then what I have to do when the guess was so-so, because I had no information to make a better guess.
And that there's always also an interesting group of healthcare professionals, and we know quite a few, the doctors who have type 1 diabetes. And we know that they look at themselves as total failures when their blood sugars are too high or too low and are out of range. So it's, I don't think there's any ill intent, of course, on any part of any of the healthcare professionals, but many are only just beginning to discover the science of complexity, and this whole idea that blood sugars are an emergent property and that there are just too many variables. And as one of our, and we wrote this in the chapter, one of our friends who is a doctor said, it's frightening if we can't use the word control. And so they make negative assumptions. And that's always very interesting to see. But we are determined to change this.
This is our mission.
Well, I know, I'm sorry, Jocko, go ahead.
I was just going to comment from a complexity point of view. It is very interesting because you have multiple agents interacting with each other, just to bring it back to the complexity part of it, or the variables, as Bao just mentioned, and the variables are constantly changing. And that what we oftentimes forget about is complex systems are far from equilibrium systems. And we're not striving for equilibrium because in a complex system, they cannot exist in equilibrium. They're constantly changing. And the fact that the interactions via the fact that they're interacting with each other change the environmental conditions. And those are always changing, and those are hierarchical all the time. So here's a really good example, a very pointed example, of course, but that complex systems, we always get the question is, how do I deal with complex systems? And our answer is always the same. It's that we are operating in the complex domain all of the time. And it is a very pointed example of one where the ramifications of going outside those ranges can be point blank deadly. But the point is we operate in complex systems in society or even on the physical level all of the time. And so really the question is, how do you operate in the simple side of things in actuality, rather than the question of how do we operate in the complex domain, because we do it all the time.
You know, there was a very important sentence in one of Riva's slides, because right now what the healthcare professionals do is they look at the numbers and then they judge. They say, you have too many high numbers or too many low, and don't you know you can get complications and blah, 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 blah. But if you accept that it is inherently complex, then, as she said, you can't be responsible for the result, but you can be responsible for the effort. So what that means is the criteria for success starts to shift. For example, the question would be to Riva, if your numbers are too low, do you know what to do? And if she would know what to do, then that would be fantastic. That's really good. And do you know something else that you could do? And then they can share maybe an additional approach. And what about if it gets too high? And what do you do when it's about to go high? Now, knowing what to do, the nudging, the navigating, or for example, to say, well, in that moment, I would take an extra reading. That would be something to congratulate somebody for, because you can't be responsible for the result, but you can be responsible for the effort and the education that you give yourself, that you do it together with the healthcare professional, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's come up quite a few, and we're kind of going deeper along this road, is how optionality plays into all of this stuff. And sort of like what you were just summarizing there is the options that are available, or knowing which options are available and which ones are outside the realm of what you want to do, given the context that you're operating in at that moment. And in a complex situation, you're constantly navigating between different contexts, depending on where your blood sugar is at this particular moment, or what the timing is, or the restaurant examples that you gave all before. Again, key concepts in complexity.
And the fact that every day is an experiment, because that's where we struggle. My mom had 20 years of type 1 diabetes at her older part of her age, and her caregiver was my dad, and she just couldn't manage it. Though we gave her a lot of advice and support, they lacked the knowledge and the intelligence to apply and fight the disease. That is very important too.
Yeah, for sure. It's really funny. Sometimes I wonder how I'd be doing if I hadn't actually entered this work. Because the fact that I work in diabetes, I'm always researching what's happening, what's new, what more is there to learn, what technology do I want? And I have so I got it at 18, until I was 40, I did not know another person with diabetes. I never talked about it because managing type 1 is so complicated. I never thought anyone could understand it. So I lived with it on my own. And it's a funny time to get it at 18, because if you get it as a kid, you're still at home with your family. So you have that support. If you get it freshman year of college and you're away at school, you don't really have any support. So the fact that I work in the field now, I have so much support, because half my friends have diabetes, and I can clue into any doctor I want. And it's just interesting. And so I've been able to take advantage of that. And I believe do what I need to do to keep myself as healthy as possible. But I don't know, if I didn't have this privilege, how it would be.
So Laurel, I know you work a lot with the healthcare industry down in Australia in terms of, trying to bring in complexity science and thinking. Any thoughts?
Yes, well, not only do I work with the healthcare industry, I'm a former healthcare professional. So
Well, I didn't want to out you.
that's all right, I'll out myself.
You know, I was trying to keep you on the DL here. You know,
albeit I worked in the mental health context, so and managing health services. I mean, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been listening is that healthcare, whether or not it happens to be diabetes or mental health care, is complex. Human beings are complex. And one of the things I think that traditional medical model approaches don't take into consideration is what's really critical in complexity, and that's about context. So that means that what you need to be doing is working with the client, the patient, the consumer, whatever you want to call them, within their own context, recognising their complexity. And I think, you know, the defaulting to these are the figures, you know, you could very happily say, well, X number of percentage of people have schizophrenia and X number of people as a result, you know, have auditory hallucinations. Therefore, if you've got auditory hallucinations, this is the way we deal with them. But, you know, it is not that clear, to be perfectly honest. And that's where I think it really falls over, that it is a lot of the healthcare, because the complexity is not recognised, because of defaulting to that traditional medical model, the context is not taken into account.
You know, we were at the World Diabetes Conference shortly before the pandemic broke out in South Korea. And because of these CGMs, the continuous glucose meters that Riva is also wearing, that is only a fairly recent phenomena. So for now, for the first time, they have what they call big data, right? Millions of data points. And so we went into a room where they were presenting about this, and here they were. And they were saying, well, it's quite obvious what needs to happen. This is the guideline, this is the guideline, this is the guideline, and this is the guideline.
Context-free data.
All about numbers without a single context. And one of my Dutch people that I coached, she was 39, got type 1 diabetes, and she was slammed by her doctor at one point because her blood sugar was above normal. And she said, yes, but at that time, I was going to go for a run. I did that deliberately. And they just judge you without even asking for the context. And that has to change because, as you say, complexity makes it, I mean, the whole Cynefin framework is about context, right?
Exactly.
So,
yeah. And when you talk, Laurel, about mental health, we once went to a conference. It's called Diabetes Sisters, basically for women with diabetes, and partners were invited. So the partners had their own track. And Bao was sitting in a lecture given by a psychologist whose whole thing was about how difficult it was for the partner. You want to tell that story?
Yeah, it was a PhD psychologist, and she started her PowerPoint, and it was all about, well, here you are, and it's very hard to live with someone with type 1 diabetes. And she just went on, and it was all negative. And so after 20 minutes, I raised my hand and I said, well, you know, I'm sorry, I just don't recognize myself in your presentation, because for me and my partner, Riva, it was another avenue to get to know each other better. And when I was finished, a second person also raised his hand and said, yes, for me, that's also. And then a third started. And to her credit, she switched off her PowerPoint and we had a free-flowing conversation. But that was also an example of how, you know, in this case, from the mental health psychology angle, they just come in with an assumption that it's all negative. Now, is it hard for a lot of people to live with a partner? Yes, it is, but not for everyone. And so they just generalize because that's what they do in medicine. They have standards. And again, it's a denial of the complexity that you talked about, Lauren.
And usually compartmentalized as well, right? Each person is trying. I've been not having similar problems, but I'm a type 2 diabetic for the last 30 years. So each person treats the symptom. And so eventually, I believe the onus is on me to solve my problems, not on any one support system. They are just a data point, and you take them with a pinch of salt. And if it doesn't make sense, ask more questions. And at home, we have impacted too. All of us eat a diabetic meal at home. My wife, my kids, we all got used to it. So they all adapted to eating that way. So as if everybody's got diabetes in the first place. So a lot of compromises are made.
Yeah, and there are, I was surprised in the beginning of this work. I interviewed people with diabetes and I interviewed diabetes educators just to learn their story. And I remember a diabetes educator saying to me, don't think family members are always supportive. Sometimes they don't like the fact that the person with diabetes is losing weight and getting healthy, right? It doesn't bode well for them if they think they should be doing that, but they don't want to. Or so, yeah, each family is functional and dysfunctional in its own way.
And in Singapore, they do recognize context. So if you're diagnosed with type 1 or type 2, they invite the whole family into a treatment plan. And they come all to the hospital. They learn how to cook differently and they get a joint education. So they start with the family as a unit rather than just with the individual. And of course, here we live in the United States, so they look at it as from an individual point of view. I know you wanted to add something more, Laurel?
No, it's fine.
But I believe Bernie had his hand up. Bernie, I saw your little fingers like tickling the edge of your frame there.
What came across to me is a lot of what you're discussing is highly time-sensitive agents. And furthermore, that they are of different cadences. And you're in a challenge to try and synchronize these multiple cadences. And that's an incredible ongoing challenge. It's also one that I don't know that the Cynefin framework really deals with well in terms of the overall time sensitivity and different agents in the time domain. So anybody care to dive into that?
Well, it really resonates with me. For example, before COVID, when Riva and I would get on an airplane and we would cross time zones, you can imagine what that does to her body, right? It's all of, so all her established patterns are in a matter of 6-7 hours completely upended. And she basically has to start her education all over. And they've tried to crack the code of that, but you can't. So yeah, it's a good question. The synchronization, the various, your liver does certain things in the morning, for example. In the beginning of our marriage, Riva, when there were no CGMs, she would tell me, if I'm not awake by 7:15, you need to wake me up because I need to blunt the rise of my blood sugar as a result of what's called the dawn syndrome. And the dawn syndrome is that your liver around 4 or 5 o'clock, and of course it's not an exact time, it's all different for different people, will start to push sugar into the body to get ready for the activity. And so now for her, that means that her blood sugar will start to rise. So, there's all of that going on. Yeah. Anybody else who wants to?
Additionally, what you're talking about for the most part, though Riva hinted at it in terms of the arrow, mostly you're dealing with snapshots rather than any kind of smoothing of the time-sensitive information. So if there was some way that the smooth data would be available as well as the snapshot to the decision maker. Additionally, there should be other inputs that might not be obvious, because right now you're looking at blood sugar and you can judge the insulin level, you're making an estimate of carbohydrates, but what about other observability things in the body, especially easily observable ones? For instance, last year I picked up an O2 meter, the simple oxygen sensor slips over the finger, and I've noticed certain things from that in terms of both cycles within a day and across activity patterns and so forth. It seems to me that there's probably other things that can enable your decision factor if people can investigate those. So
yeah, that when the beta cells go, other hormones also die off. So there is at least one known other hormone that Riva doesn't have. And still, even though everybody knows that medically, they're still saying, but you've got to control your blood sugar. So it's not just that she doesn't produce insulin, but there's other stuff also.
Yes.
And yes, if you want, of course, these days, if you have an Apple Watch, it will give you at regular intervals your oxygen levels of the blood, because it can actually look in there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I'm in awe of your discipline around this. So
Thank you. It takes a Virgo. I don't know how else you do it.
Yeah.
And thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Bernie.
I see Rebecca. Rebecca, were you raising your hand or just clutching your head? Okay, good. Yes, please.
One of the things that you mentioned in the presentation, Riva, was in the picture of the framework on the complex side. It always starts with probe, and I thought it was really interesting and worth noting that oftentimes the probing is just waiting and not actually doing anything, and just sort of seeing, is that arrow going to flatten out, or do I actually need to take that recursive action and do something to sort of shift the system or try and make it change. And that, I think, is something that I always forget, that you don't necessarily actually have to do something, that it can be, probe or just observe and kind of get your bearings and see what's happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's very Zen-like, isn't it, right? Doing nothing is doing something.
Yeah, that's it. They also call that the Wu Wei principle, right? Effortless action, not doing something, is doing something. Yeah.
Okay, Wes is excited now. That got him. That was the one that got him, Rebecca. Congratulations.
I think he's listening to dance music.
No. It's just inspirational words. And I mean, especially in the work, as we share on here, I have to go out and live that lesson a lot during the rest of the week. So that's why I got excited.
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the most interesting parts of this, and one of the reasons I'm so glad we could do this talk, is that, people forget what a stigma used to be attached to this disease as well. Like, I remember early in my career, because nobody used to talk about it too. Like, it was all sort of, you didn't mention it unless you actually had to. And I was working in an organization, and one of the junior executives collapsed. And none of us knew what was wrong with him. And we knew he hadn't been drinking, but before he collapsed, it seemed a little bit like he might have. But, we just had to call an ambulance because we didn't know what was happening. And then eventually, he told his boss that he was a type 1 diabetic. But, the whole business of having to carry around needles, because in the olden days, it was like, hypodermic needles, and there was a lot of stigma and silence attached to this as well. And Laurel, to your point about mental illness, which is sort of on the same trajectory, I think the more sort of light we can shed on what these sort of chronic conditions and what living with them looks like, the more light we can shed on that, the better able we'll be able to see how these complex systems exist all around us all the time.
Can I ask a question of the group? Did this, because I've never put this presentation together before, did this make sense to you? Did this showcase that complexity science and the Cynefin framework could be a good tool for health professionals and people with diabetes to better understand and do sense making.
Yes, I think so. First off, you are very charismatic. You tell a great story. So you pulled us into your story and you gave us great detail and example. And then that allows people to go into this framework that you're talking about and not be sort of mesmerized by it, but inside your story in the context of the framework. So yes, it's very effective.
Great, thank you.
Marcy, were you raising a hand or were you just thumbs
No,
upping?
yeah, not a healthcare professional, though lately have been at a lot of doctor's appointments and just yes in spades. Yeah, and just really appreciate, Riva, this. I know you said it, putting yourself out there and combining the personal and the professional, really profound.
Thank you.
Matt, did you have your hand up?
Absolutely, yeah. I also wanted to commend Riva for this, supporting your question. One of the things that is very clear from your presentation, and I think this at least is something that Ballard said, is that there's a tendency, certainly within the medical profession, but many other professions too, to presume control or create the appearance of control. And it's a fallacy, you know? And there's so many industries in the world that they still have to, if not get past that, embrace the fact that they're not always in control. That there's some things where there's only influence. There are some things where observation has to happen. And I think that seemed to be, certainly in the history of your story, the assumption of control and the stigma that if you are diabetic and you're not control, you're not believing the advertising about being in control, there's some negative blowback on you. So I think that in general, maybe Laurel could jump in there too. The medical profession, amongst many other professions, does presume that and project that, maybe erroneously, part of the time.
I mean, it strikes me that the traditional medical profession like to be not only in control, but also the expert. And it's about ego and expertise. Whereas if we're thinking complexity, the expertise lies within the system, not within one person up there. So it's about multiple perspectives, which, heavens above, let's forbid, it might also be the patient's perspective, you know. And the expertise actually lies at a different level, and the knowledge actually lies. So it's about the experience of the person, which is the expertise, not the stuff that's in somebody's head academically.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
The interesting thing. The interesting thing about the experts, though, is they're in a bind themselves. They're in a complex situation themselves because they're oftentimes expected to be the expert. So to cut them a little bit of slack is that if a doctor behaves in a way that is not as expertly as you might like them to be, they will get even more grief. Right. So another example of complexity.
Yeah, that's very educating.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Jocko, because many of the doctors have these standards that are imposed on them, and that if they don't tell the standard to the patient, they're actually non-compliant. So it's not just the system of patient and healthcare professional, but it's also the super system in which they then have to operate with the insurance companies, with the medical boards that they are part of. So we're looking here at pushing a ball, boulder up the mountain. What I personally, what I've always said to Riva, I said when we wrote that chapter, most of us discussed the Cynefin framework and complexity theory in the context of organizations. And that's true for me too. I explained this at corporations, and then we, based on that, we change certain actions that they do, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that it's a sense-making framework because we all have to act in the world, and it is, I think we are, as a married couple, it works here in our household when we have to make sense of what's happening. With type 1 diabetes, but also in my coaching practice. working with individuals who have relationship problems, etc., you can very beautifully use this framework, because we are all educated under this dominant narrative that it's controllable. So it's, I do this, why does my partner not do this? Or why does my boss not do this? Or my colleague not do this? And then when you give them a little 10-minute explanation, it's like the whole world changes for them and they suddenly see the light. So I would encourage anyone to, if you're not using it already at an individual level, when there's opportunity, then it's really, it's a beautiful framework.
Duri, you had kind of a nuts and bolts question you put in the chat. You want to unmute yourself and ask your question to Riva?
Well, this might have been already answered, but one of the challenges I've had with the framework for a while is that you have, when you're describing the different approaches, sometimes it can be a little confusing. So in the complex domain, we probe, sense, and respond. In the complicated domain, we sense, analyze, respond. I think I got that right. But the way you described it, I don't know if I'm characterizing it right, but when you thought about complexity and then you changed your approach, would it be accurate to say that just the emphasis changed from getting it right to responding to information? I don't know if you could just talk about that a little bit more and characterize it a bit. It might be helpful for me to finally wrap my head around this.
I think, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the impact of understanding that I cannot control my blood sugar no matter what, that I basically live in this complex domain, took this self-criticism, this hedons to perfectionism, self-blame off my shoulders. And yes, made it easier to say, okay, this is the number. Can I think back why this may have happened so that I know for future? And whether or not I can, what's the best thing to do going forward without the blame and perfectionism and self-criticism? So when I talk about it liberating people, it truly makes you feel like this ball and chain around your leg that I've got to control this monster goes away. Does that help?
Oh, and I think there's some additional, because when you are in the complicated domain, basically you calculate your way to a solution. And there are expert rules for that. And there may be a variety of roads, right? So different good practices. And it means that there is hierarchy. So in other words, the expert knows and you just comply with the expert. But when you move over to the complex domain, then apart from the attitudinal dimension that Riva talked about, that, oh, I don't need to be repaired. I'm not broken. This is how the world is. When you talk about the relationship between healthcare professional and patient, then you're talking more about an equal relationship. And then the starting point is, let me understand what the context is of the patient. She lives somewhere in a home. Who lives with her? And if it's a Spanish family, then probably rice might be a staple, and all sorts of foods come with that. So you try to understand context. Now, if you want to try to understand context with a patient, you have to start to explore more. So your strategy would be to ask much more explorative questions. And then what you also realize is that standards that apply in the complicated domain will not work in the complex domain. So you have to say, well, Riva is unique as it is. So what can I learn? What has she already tried? And what has she known? And how old is she? Because, certain life stages will have certain effects. on your blood sugar and how you live. So you start much more working not from a repair mode, but from an understanding, an explorative, and then to say, well, let's try some experiments. And what are you actually able to do? Because it's one thing that we are very privileged to have a CGM, continuous glucose meter, but the majority of people with type 1 diabetes don't have one. So that means they have maybe 1 or 2 data points every 5 hours if they actually check their blood sugar a number of times. So they have very few data points, and that changes everything. So I would say that if you're looking at it from the relationship perspective, then as an expert, you will, and this is exactly what Laurel indicated, and Riva talks about is, you then have at least 2 experts in the room. And that means you have to start each other to treat like equals. And not like, you know, what happened to our friend. There's only one way to check your blood sugar and prick your finger. And if you mistake this best practice for a situation where there are actually many good practices, because checking your blood sugar is classically more in the complicated domain, there are various ways to do it, you disengage people, you disengage the patient. So recognizing that the context of the patient at home and in their work and how they move about life, and that changes because doctors will tell you there's this famous book that was written by, I think, Dr. Koopman. Within 20 seconds or so, in 12 seconds, they interrupt the patient and they tell you what to do.
Jerome Groopman.
Yeah, Jerome Groopman. Yeah. So that changes. Does that help, Jury?
Greatly. Thank you.
Okay. Now, for those of you that have been here before, you know that we're rapidly approaching my bedtime, and that so we're coming towards the end of the meetup. But before we wrap it up, I see some new faces, and I'd like to just touch base with them. Chris, you haven't been here before. Do you have anything you want to ask, add, comment on, speculate about?
Hi, yes, nice to meet you guys. I'm on the other coast of North America. I live on a little island near Vancouver. And hi, Bo, hi, Riva. Nice to see you guys.
Nice to see you.
I was also in the Cynefin book, so I got treated to Bo's pen, which was great as an editor. Yeah, I actually wanted to give you feedback on what did you think of my presentation, because I thought it was great. And I actually, when I first read about Dave's story on his controlling his diet or working with his diabetes, and that he blogged about for many, many years, and then reaffirming it in yours, it changed the way I look after my body, actually. And I wonder that when you're presenting this material, you go deep into your story, but just to, I'm sorry I missed the beginning, but just to have people reflect on, like, what is a complex health challenge you have? And for me, it's just getting older. It's like managing my own, like my weight does things it didn't used to do when I was 30 or whatever, my mental health as well. The journey that I've gone through the last couple of decades, I can recognize in the approach, like, some really helpful tools. So yes, letting go of control, like a big piece of your story and a big piece of what's critical to be able to be here. And also this idea of expertise, which not only is like, doctors aren't experts, but neither are patients. Like, we have to overcome I think you pointed to it, Bo, we have to overcome our tendency to think that we're the expert. A doctor doesn't know anything, it's like you get one bad diagnosis or one bad bedside manner, and suddenly, it's actually letting go of that and being curious, entering into this curious state of mind. And then the tools for healthcare practitioners, the tools that have been most useful to me from healthcare practitioners are the heuristics for managing the complex parts. If I have to administer medication, I need to know exactly how to do that. But in terms of shopping for food, like a heuristic is really helpful, right? Like stay to the outside of the grocery store is always a good heuristic for me. I'm not diabetic, so that's just the healthier foods are on the outside aisles, never go in. And then for a patient, the other way of treating healthcare practitioners is about like the idea of bounded applicability. So I went to my doctor and he's, I started a new relationship with a doctor and he said, "What do you want out of me?" And I said, "Just numbers. I just need numbers from you. You can do a bit of diagnosis and all that kind of stuff, but I'm really here for numbers. I've got how else are you managing your health?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh, that's really good. like I can see where the numbers would help you, right? Because it helps me to monitor my progress rather than hit targets, that kind of thing. So I just think it's a really, really helpful example, Riva. It's a really great story, and inviting people to think about like where their own health challenges are, because we all have them. We're all just temporarily enabled, right? We'll eventually all be disabled or brought down by something. I think that's just a really good way to make it relatable and practical, because ultimately that's what Cynefin is. So thank you. It was a gift to be here.
Thank you.
I'm here because Wes invited me. So if anything I've done, he can blame Wes for that.
Well, please come back. But before I make Dave talk, I just wanted to say, Riva, I don't know everybody that was involved in the Cynefin book, but I've met enough of them to say to you, what were you thinking? I mean, Bao has been in this world a long time, but I mean, I've done some editing work and I salute you.
Thank you. Yes, it was. But it was a great learning experience. Like when I wrote my first diabetes book, Beth said, "This is going to be your master's." And so, in a way, this was my real introduction to understanding.
And on the book, we should say it was a wonderful team. Working with with Sonia and with Jen, it was a wonderful team, and also working with the authors. This was done in record time.
Yeah, 4 months or so.
Yeah, 5 months, and that was really in great part because the authors also came through. So, and Chris was one of them.
Aren't you diplomatic? Dave, you're a new face. Any thoughts, comments?
I've been here before.
You have?
You just don't recognize the face. It's okay. Not a problem. Any comments? Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of issues, especially dealing with doctors. We do have that whole persona, you're the patient. I know more than you know, whatever. I'll give you a quick example. I have a child that still has a condition that nobody could come up with a diagnosis for, involved numerous things. There was like a 20-year search for whatever was going on. But in the beginning, we were seeing the experts, the people that actually wrote the textbooks on these conditions. And we were in Boston and we went to see this doctor, and it's like we had a file that was this thick of everything. And we tried talking to this doctor, and it's like, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. He had 10 residents that came in and did all sorts of, we spent a full day there. All right. And he came back in and goes, we have a diagnosis for you. No problem. He starts going through all his residents. And it's like, okay, so what is it? And And my wife looks at him and goes, excuse me, doctor, but if you go back into the file and look on such and such a date, you'll see that the definitive test for that condition was already done and it's negative. All right. So the process of listening to a patient and understanding what they're talking about and at least get that background, because the odds are the patient knows more about his condition than the doctor does. Okay, here are the symptoms. Here's what I'm experiencing. Add to that the whole emphasis on trying to get medical records. Okay, we now have this whole thing of medical records where we're spending more time in the doctor's office where they're typing on a computer and trying to put information in there. And when you get that report, and I don't know about anybody else, but we always ask for that report because we want copies of it. All right. Every time you'll go back in and it's like, you look at it and then you have to call them and say, excuse me, doctor, but that whole thing is wrong. You wrote down the wrong information. This didn't occur here. This wasn't this condition, whatever. So yeah, how do you deal with that? I don't know. I mean, it's more of a psychological thing. It's more of a cultural issue to deal with. And I can tell you this because I see that it can change, because I have a child who is an ER doctor, and talking about understanding context for the patient When he was in medical school, that was the whole big emphasis, that you now had to deal with the patient as a person, not just as a condition. All right. So hopefully it's changing.
Yeah, no, to your point, Riva has also had her fair share of firing endocrinologists because they were not really listening, or they were, but she now has one that treats her as equal. And actually, a few years ago, when she changed one of her what is called a basal insulin, that is a 24-hour insulin, she and him were texting each other over the weekend, so that he was helping her with these little safe to fail experiments to titrate and to figure out, at what point would she be at a kind of right doses, and et cetera, et cetera. And he really treated her, and it warmed my heart when she told me, like, Dr. Lamb is texting me. And then he said to her, "You are now a case study in my department. I'm talking about you, how you've done this and how it worked, et cetera, et cetera." Now, that is extraordinary. So there are very good doctors around, but you have to find them.
Yeah, well, it leads to the fact that, years ago, when I was a child, at any rate, the doctor was the person. You didn't question, you didn't do anything. And over the course of my life, I've learned very quickly that no, you interview your doctor, okay? You interview them as if, you're hiring them to do a job, all right? So they should have the expertise, but you need that personnel relationship back and forth as well. And yeah, that's the bottom line, there's the context really is everything when it's dealing with that.
All right, well, it's 7:42. We've kept Riva long enough. Riva, I do sense that there might be a follow-up presentation here on how you use complexity science to manage BOW. And I, for one, would be fascinated by that presentation. So, and also, BOW, next time she fires a doctor, please record it, because I'd like to hear that too. I think that could be a very entertaining conversation. I want to thank everyone Jocko and I want to thank everyone for coming. We haven't firmed up next month's presentation yet, but if any of you have any thoughts, feelings, emotions, plans you'd like to share, hit us up. You can always reach me through the Meetup app. And once again, thank you very much, Jocko. Any parting words?
No, just a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. And thanks for your time and the energy. I know it took a lot to put into it. And thanks everybody for showing up.
Yeah. And Riva, we can't thank you enough. And Bao, thanks for the tech support. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.